We're not going to talk technical today. We're talking about risks, but we will cover off. It kind of draws everything in. So I may as well start with the old share the screen. Right. Can everybody see my screen? Says managing information risks. Great. Okay, good. So you're experienced business people. You've had businesses. You're in a business right now, and you've worked for other businesses. So in theory, information risk management, same as business risk management. Yes and no. Okay. Yes, we have the same charts, information, likelihood, and probability, and we still think about mitigating those risks. But I think it's not exactly the same, because whereas you might say there's a business risk that there'll be a downturn in the economy and my product will not sell. Well, okay, once or twice a year, maybe we might see that reflected in data that we could think about. Whereas information risks, at one level, the risk is coming true every minute. If you have a website and it's in public, then a bot is thinking about hacking you right now. So the risk is live and becomes quite operational. But and also when we think about information risks, they go down and down and down, right? There's systems supporting systems supporting systems. So again, rather than just simply having a high level risk that says there's a risk that the system goes down, instead you're breaking into components, you're thinking about different parts of that infrastructure. So less about the annual review that you might be used to, taking your risk map to the board and saying risks are where they were. It's more about driving operational action. And as I was just kind of touching on a few minutes ago, it brings in a bunch of overlapping things, information risk, right? So it brings in compliance like privacy, and it brings in security. So I've got a slide here that kind of highlights that. So security concerns are about unauthorized system behavior, right? Privacy concerns are about authorized behavior, right? You have the data, but are you supposed to be doing it, right? In the middle is a little overlap where an unauthorized person has access to that personal information. So you can see how privacy and security quite similar. So here I am, a data protection officer. I'm talking mostly about privacy, but in actual fact today, many things will come in that are actually not about privacy, but just about information risk. Yeah. Okay. So the process of managing information risk should be very familiar, right? This would be the process you would use for any other risk in the business or any other problem in the business. Some different things though. We have some terminology we use, right, that are common throughout information risk management. So if you're going to get into ISO 27001 or any one of these standards, these terms will come up and we may as well learn what they are. So that will be part of today. Process will start with our information asset audit, right? We don't do that for standard risk, so that's something new. We're going to go and take a map of all the systems you use in your business, not just the ones containing personally identifiable information. So this is where, again, we're saying not just the privacy concerns, but all the information assets you have. We'll discuss what an asset is in a minute. We're going to brainstorm the risks. Again, risk management may contain this, but this to the nth degree is more complicated in the sense that we're going to really have to put our mind into our headspace into the mind of people who may wish us harm. We have to really imagine we are them in order to see where our vulnerabilities are. We're going to analyze threats and vulnerabilities, two terms. Prioritize, same as standard risk. Developing controls, this is the same as mitigation, but again, it's a term we're going to use throughout information risk, is the concept of a control. ISO has 144 controls, right? The control is you have to have a password to access the system, right? That is a control. It prevents a series of vulnerabilities. It reduces a series of risks. We're going to review that periodically every year. We're going to review it. We're going to have at least that minimum of reviewing our information assets every year, or else we're going to review it whenever we add an asset. So we can have it as a continuous process. So that is, I would think, fairly standard for our general risk management. So what is an information risk? What is contained in it? One, an asset. There must be one asset. A threat, usually just one, right? So we say an event that could cause a loss, right? We say an event, not just a hacker, but a power outage, right? The internet goes off. A server refuses to boot, right? So sometimes we have actors that are doing things. Sometimes those are accidents, right? Sometimes they are deliberate. So the threat is just the event that would cause a loss event, right? A vulnerability is a weakness in our total system, right? That could be exploited. A weakness could be very simple. There was no password on this server, and there can never be one, for example. I can't imagine how that would be, but that would be a weakness, right? A weakness would be a person who's not well trained, right? So vulnerabilities are either the event triggers the vulnerability, or an actor makes use of the vulnerability. So again, a term we use a lot, and there are lists of vulnerabilities, right? The risk impact, very similar to standard risk management. I would say that these days there are tools available to help us explain risks in quite detailed ways that I find at times really useful. For example, if a loss event is once a year and that loss event results in the loss of a contract of £50,000, we can now start to put some values on that risk, right? And start to say, well, so that's what would happen if it came true. Well, we shouldn't spend more than 50,000, right? So we can now say, well, what should we do about it? We could put it into a pound value, rather than just simply saying it's a high risk. What should we do about it? If it's a high risk, we should do anything. Well, maybe not, right? So the risk likelihood, again, that probability that we normally do in risk management. So how likely, how often, priority will relate to the value and the frequency. And then we have controls, sometimes many controls, right? Sometimes just one. So that's if you like, that's the anatomy of an information risk, similar to a general risk with a few of these terms thrown in. So an asset.
It's Natalie here. Just a quick.
Yes, of course.
I mean, I guess it probably helps to also think about the data subject that you're talking about. So who is it? Whose data? Whose personal data are we talking about protecting here? Is it the employee? Is it the customer? Is it whose data are we, is it?
And it might not be. Well, this is a good point to have this slide up. Excuse me. It might not be personal data. For
sure,
example,
but if it is,
it could be your intellectual property. It could be. So if you look on the left, there's the things that are information assets. On the right, things that are not information assets. Right. So yes, absolutely, customer data. Right. Human resources data. I totally agree. They both contain the PII element, they contain the privacy element, and they contain the confidentiality element. But financial records, right? They're also an information asset that if you didn't have it today and you needed it today, that will be a problem. Therefore, there's a risk that you don't have your financial records when you need them, right? Intellectual property, right? If you emailed your business plans to your competitors, right? Now, a lot of you are in spheres that are a kind of a combination of highly competitive, but also societally benevolent, social enterprise. And you think about your competitors often as, elements of a cooperative sphere. But that might not always be true. And there might be somebody who would literally like to steal your idea because they have a way of monetizing it in a different country, and they'd like to do that, please. So if you accidentally release that data, if they had access to that data, that's harm to you. So it's a combination of individual records, but also things, inventory levels. How many things do you have in stock? If that information is suddenly wrong, then you might find yourself unable to meet customer expectations, unable to deliver goods. Again, it's not about people, but it might be about things. Obviously, your emails, your thing, and then at the bottom, and all your application infrastructure, right? Without that, again, it doesn't matter what data is being protected. So you can see that an information asset, some people describe it as a piece of information. This record, just this record and just this number, right? That a phone number for an important client is an asset, as well as the whole record, as well as the system. Things that are not assets, information assets, obviously physical, right? So we've got our buildings and equipment. These are not information assets. Tangible items like books or leaflets you might produce. Opinions, obviously, right? Also things that you've released in public. So, the content of your website is not actually itself an information asset because it's already given away, right? The web server is an information asset with regards to its availability, but not the content on it. But it can be available everywhere else. It's, the internet Wayback Engine will keep a copy of your website for you throughout time. You can see what it used to look like. Again, stuff that you've released perhaps on the company's house. Again, that's not an asset because you've already released it. It's now in the public domain. So it's really things that you have and own, and that only you have and own, right? And that if you were to lose it for some reason, it would bring some harm to your business. That's an information asset. So this is, for example, a very high level example of what an information asset register might contain. So who has the asset, the name of this asset, a description, what kind of asset is it, what is the purpose of the asset, and some organizations have that kind of sort of protective marking to say, how should I treat it? All right, so it could be company confidential, it could be sensitive. So you can see here that I'm including 100% zero, right? Even though you didn't develop the product, it's not one of your, you don't have a dev team working on it, so it might not feel like an asset. Of course it's an asset because it contains stuff that if you suddenly didn't have it, right, or if it was suddenly incorrect, or you accidentally shared it, would bring potential damage to your company or to your customers. You could have 50 assets, you could have 100 assets. I don't think you're going to have 3 assets, right? You're going to have some number in the tens, right? A large organization could have thousands, right, of information assets. How detailed? If we think about it from a privacy perspective, right, in zero, there is at least HR, and there are at least 2 functions, right, in HR, and in accounts, there may also be supplier management, there may also be invoicing. So you may have several lines for zero. And when you are thinking about your compliance with the Data Protection Act, the ICO will expect you to be reasonably granular about the types of processing you do. So again, you could imagine this being in a system that has a 0 item and then maybe 1 or 2 sub items. So the level of detail will happen over time, but you can at least start with this. And if there was a complaint to the ISO, for example, they would expect you to produce an information asset register. So it's valuable on multiple fronts. So you've got your assets, and in what way are we trying to protect them? So we talk about, we want to protect the assets from a variety of harms. And this is a useful acronym we have, the CIA, that allows us to then create a framework for thinking about the harm. Okay, so CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Okay, confidentiality is often what we think about as the only thing, right? So it's the number one thing we think about. We don't want to release our data to someone shouldn't have it. Okay, so that is what we think about when we think about privacy, right? So privacy is focused around that confidentiality, right? And that can be external and it can be internal. So staff salaries is a good example of an internal confidentiality on personal data. So we have to think about, it would be bad if everybody could see everybody's salaries. There are organizations that dispute that and say just make it public, but for the most part, everybody gets a little squirrely about senior management compensation. So confidentiality, really clear. Just as important, this is a triad and not in order, right? Integrity. Integrity is your data correct? And the concept of provenance for data is really tricky, especially at the senior level, people saying, right, so give me the data that shows me how I should make a decision. They say, well, this is the financial forecast. And you go, how do you know it's right? They go, I don't know. So how do you know this is a correct set of data? You go, I don't know, right? And the absence of provenance means that we can have decision fatigue. We don't know how to make a decision. I can make poor decisions. The classic is the spreadsheet that has been modified by 5 different people. There are 5 different versions. One of them is correct. One of them contains an error. One of them contains a cut and paste that went wrong, a formula that is flawed, right? We all are presented with that. And so integrity of data, if your doctor has the wrong data associated with your record, they can give you a false diagnosis. So the integrity, how do you protect it, right? Different from release. And then the third one is availability. So the right person can access the right data at the right time. That is another purpose of a security policy or a security strategy. If a person who has the right privileges should have this data now, cannot, that is also a security fail, right? Because they needed it now. They needed it because they have a patient in front of them. They need it now because they're about to go to a meeting to make a decision or make a bid or win some money or blah, 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 right? And so availabilities, I mean, for those of you who are applying for things like NHS grants or NHS contracts, they're keen on this availability. Can you guarantee, what is your uptime for being able to ensure that your advice service is in front of my customers when they need it? So these are the three things, broadly speaking, pretty holistic, that we can say we are attempting to protect our information assets from negatives in this sphere. Okay. So we come to our the most creative part of risk management. And if I'm asked to do this for customers, they occasionally say, John, come in and run this session for us, because we're going to go down rabbit holes. And so what could go wrong with a business and their information systems? Fantastically creative moment, and you should all enjoy it, right? It's a chance to put on other hats. It's a chance to think outside the box and pretend to be a criminal, and try and figure out, why would somebody want to get access to my data? And often we would think, well, I can't think of a reason, because there's no credit cards in here. They're just young people's data, and it's just like they're having some mental health problems. And the data set is just, us offering them some, wellness advice. You kind of think, well, so who would want to know that? And then you have to say, well, what about abusers? What about someone who's abusing that child? What if they wanted to know what the child was saying? It could be a parent, right? Parents are often the abusers. So when you start to think like that, you're going, whoa, this is dark. And you go, yes, please go to the dark place and imagine who might want harm to the people in your database. Not necessarily money from you. Don't always think about money. Again, if you are a one of these refugees, right? Who might want access to that data? If you're, sort of a battered wives refuge. If you are a mental health recovery space or an addiction recovery space, who might really want to know who your customers are, and who might turn that into value through, reputation or bullying, whatever later. So this is this slide is here is just to say the next phases are really about creativity. You're going to do a predicted root cause analysis of why it failed. You're going to predict a failure, right? And you're going to ask yourself, how did this happen, right? Here are 4 examples of processes you can use. I won't go into them. The 5 whys is the classic Toyota. Something went wrong. Why did it go wrong? So the server's down. Why is it down? Because the power failed. Why did the power fail? Because the supplier cut the line. Why is there no backup? Because we decided not to buy one. Why did we decide not to buy one? Because we don't have a policy that says there should be a redundancy for a power supply. Now, that's a policy, 5 whys in. And now we can go, okay, fine, we can create a policy. Yes, you can. We should have had a policy. We didn't have one. Is there a why about why we don't have policies? Well, we've never done a review. Okay, so the root cause of why your server failed is because you've never done this task. So that's the first task. So in other words, at the very top of the controls list is a risk management policy, is having a risk map. These are themselves controls. We don't think of them in that way. Initially, we think of them as, perhaps standard business practice, but they are in fact controls to help prevent, right, future problems as a root cause. Ishikawa, that's the herringbone diagram. You've seen that, kind of looks like a fish. It has some big bones and then smaller bones, and we're going to think of ways of filling out those bones in a minute. Fault trees, another hierarchical view. And the final one is the expert opinion. So who's going to be in this room with you? You should have some of your most egregious staff members are always finding problems. Have them in there. If they know their way around your systems, they've always said there's a problem. You should have them in the room, because they will help say, yeah, well, I can see 5 weaknesses that I've been telling you about for ages, here, here, and here. So expert opinion, and that can be generic expert. In some ways, for each of your businesses, I'm a generic expert. You could still bring me in because I might help steer the conversation around to areas that I don't feel it's in. So, how we do our brainstorming, lots of possibilities. So, are some terms. You have threats, and we have our weaknesses, and we have our controls. So, what are threats? As I said, they're events. They can involve people, or they can involve non-people, right? It can also be divided up into 2 ways, which I've done here. I don't like this graph, but I will improve it next time. On the top, we have non-intentional, and on the bottom, we have intentional, right? On the left, we have internal, or on the right, we have external. right? And I've actually put one of them in red, and that is because in the end, I think this is where all of your problems are going to occur, in the internal non-intentional. That is to say, errors. Most IT problems, most outages, most issues that I've had. So my background, Fabrice, is actually as an IT director. I'm now in the data protection space, in the compliance space, in this kind of information consultancy space. But my background, 25 years, is as an IT director of things like the National Theatre, V&A, Cancer Research UK, Shelter, some housing associations. And I know as an IT director that most likely things going to happen is that somebody's going to make a mistake. Okay, they're going to delete a database they shouldn't have, right? They're going to merge two databases together and they're going to do it wrong. They're going to restore a problem with the wrong version and no one notices until several months later. They're going to take some data. There's a problem. They can't access the Google Drive, right? They can't seem to reset their password. Somebody needs to get this data set that I've been working on my laptop. So I email it to my data analyst. Unfortunately, that has a very similar name as that journalist I was accessing recently, who wanted to know if I was a problem, right? This journalist might be working in the culture war space, and sees your trans health organization as probably do-gooding, middle class, assholes, and has already asked you for your opinion on like transitioning under 18. So they've already got you on the list, and you've just accidentally emailed them a list of personally identifiable information. How bad is that? It's a disaster, right? And it's not intentional. You didn't mean to do it. It was an error, right? And in fact, if we did our 5 whys, if you didn't have access to Google Drive, right? So that's a fail. Why was that? Well, because IT department was off sick that day, the one guy who could have fixed the problem, right? But there's another why, which is, why did you think it was okay to email? Well, because you didn't have a policy that said never email personally identifiable information as a disciplinary offense, right? Why don't you have that policy? Because we haven't done this analysis. We're not compliant, actually. We haven't been through this process. So again, your 5 whys explore a combination of operational, don't have enough staff, don't have self-reset on your passwords, don't have a policy, and all of these things are errors. No one intended any of these things to happen, which is why this top left-hand box is a very important set of threads, right? Below that is our internal intentional. So if error is the top one, this below, we can broadly classify it as fraud. Those are people who do mean you harm. I mean, I remember it was in a little class, and a sort of a fraud class, and they said, right, everybody stand up. And in a housing association, they said, right, sit down if you're under 35, sit down if you're over 55, sit down if you're a woman, sit down if you don't work in IT or finance. And there was 5 or 6 of us left, gray-haired men. They said, you're it. If there's fraud in this organization, it's probably you, because you have children of a certain age that are really expensive. You can't maintain all these mortgages and payments and education expenses and healthcare. You can't maintain all that. Your salaries are not rising fast enough. You know how you could commit fraud because you work in finance and IT. So you know you could set up a supplier, a fake one, attach it to your bank account. You know how you could fake the authority for that. You know how to set up a regular £499 payment a month. So it's probably you. I'm not accusing you of it, but it is probably you. That's statistical. And housing associations are suffering from 1 or 2% fraud in every single one. Not everything that's going on in that organization is legit. It could be destruction. Someone could hate you, right? And they've been fired. They've got a serious grievance. They press the destruct button as they leave. Equally, they could just sell your data. They could sell your IP to a competitor. So that's internal, right? The tricky part is they have lots of access, right? And it's intentional. The controls are things like, how you recruit, right? How you performance manage, right? Controls around how you actually let somebody go, the specific procedures for on the day when someone is suspended. First thing that happens is their rights are revoked, so forth. Top right, suppliers, it's external, but it's not intentional. But there's nothing you can do about it. They don't want it to happen. And many of the times we outsource to our suppliers because we know they're better at this than we are. So Microsoft is fully ISO, Google is fully ISO, right? Amazon fully ISO, they're fully GDPR. They have all these things and they have whole departments to do it. So we can outsource comfortably and we can treat these risks as quite low because 1, they're not intentional, and 2, we believe that they're quite professional. But some of them are small, some of them are little remaining in data development houses. You know, they're quite cheap. They're over there, they're very far away, but they're just 3 people. And so they're just like you, and they could become a supply chain weakness for you. And then finally, the classic external intentional. So that's your cyber threat. Those are your criminals. And we often think that's who I'm thinking about. As you can see, that's often not who we're thinking about, right? Unless you have a lot of really good credit card data, right? Then are you really a threat? No, who's coming after you? Nobody. You know, if you're not in the business of spying, then the governments are not after you. So now we're talking about opportunists. So someone discovers that you might have something and has a little go at cracking your database. Maybe they could sell it to somebody else. So, you know, the true cyber criminal, you know, you'll have to tell me that you believe that you're vulnerable to that, because generally I'd be saying it's going to be accidental if that happens. But as I said earlier, what about abusers? What about people who might wish harm to your specific customers because of their age, because of some attribute about them? They could be famous, for example. Peter Crouch, a Liverpool footballer, was robbed 5 times on a Saturday because people knew he wasn't in his house, because he was on the football pitch, right, with his entire family. So it's an easy time. That knowledge about his presence, he never fixed it. Come on, you should know about it. But he was robbed repeatedly on a Saturday. And what if, in actual fact, I broke into the V&A customer database? Well, you know, is it really interesting? Yes, it is. It contains some incredibly wealthy individuals. It contains Tony Blair. We'll know if Tony Blair is at an event. So we know Tony Blair is not in his house. So we could break into Tony Blair's house because we know he's attending a theatre event. We know he's attending a V&A premiere. So you can, who's in the database might be why someone could think about harm them. So that's our threats.
John, unfortunately, I have another meeting at 30. It's super interesting for me. And just to know, you record this session, you will send it probably, isn't it?
I will, of course.
Yeah.
And I'm available, right? You can reach out to me through the Foundry and say any chance of an hour, 100%, right? So if you would like to catch up on any of this, or create a specific session, that's absolutely part of the Foundry offer. Right.
Great.
I'm rarely in there, but we can 100% do a Zoom at any time.
That will so yeah, that will be great, because we are currently setting up actually a new infrastructure, like in terms of like especially with our CRM, and then trying to look if we are IPAC compliant, or like all basically being sure that we are sort of like meet certain standard. So that would potentially be great to catch up later also.
Absolutely, reach out through Natalie or my there's various contact details.
Thanks so much.
100%.
It's very enjoyable. Thanks so much for that.
No problem. See you, Fabrice.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Right, Natalie and Natalie. It's now getting into a one-to-one session. Right. Wait, so Natalie, just jump in at any point, right? Natalie, not Natalie. Right. Don't, you know, we can pause, we can go off topic whenever you find something, because I know you were at a conference, weren't you? You were at a conference a few weeks ago. So I'm imagining I'm actually thinking you'll be a person who's probably well up on all of this kind of high level sphere, at least. So if you want to dive into anything, just shout as I pass it.
Yeah, no, that would be great. Thank you. I'll let you know.
Yeah, of course.
It's really good. It's really interesting. Thank you.
So those are our threats. And so, and as we get into the detail, we start to talk about threat actors, threat domains. It's a smorgasbord. You could spend a week thinking about threats and finding ways of analyzing them, of subdividing them, of treating them. And of course, they have threat vectors. You know, a threat actor could be someone who then says, I need the cleaner. That's what I need. So they go to the cleaner, who's all poorly paid, and says, you get to wander about the organization. You go, yeah. So how about if I paid you £500 per password you can discover on a post-it note? So all you have to do, you just take a picture of it, because you're around there at night, no one's around. If you see a password on a post-it note, I'll pay you £500 each. All right. Now that's a poorly paid cleaner. Of course, you know, they might say, no, I am, of course, but they equally could say, what's the harm? I'm not the one committing the crime. So they could do that. A person could be internal staff, but you know that they're badly paid, and you could say, how about I offer you? I mean, we had an internal fraud at Shelter. A guy was caught only because he turned up in a car that just did not make sense. He was the building cleaning manager. It just didn't make any sense for him to have that particular Lexus, whatever. And his mistake was the manager said, I want you to renew the contract. I want to see if there's a better price from our cleaners. He said, yeah, no worries. I'll ask them. He came back and said, yeah, they've offered 1%. So that should be fine. Yeah. And his name was in the list of directors at the bottom of this. It was his company. He was essentially employing his own company. So, to do this, and he made a small mistake in that he produces, otherwise he wouldn't have spotted it. He'd been communicating with us as a third party for many years, right? So, the vectors by which a threat actor will do this is full of social engineering. It won't always be technical. In many cases, it'd be highly internal and highly specific. So vulnerabilities. You could divide this up any number of ways. This is a classic 6. There are 4. There are, blah, blah, blah. Software, right? If your software has a weakness, right? Imagine that it's very old, right? It hasn't been updated, right? It contains several vulnerabilities to technical attack. And we often talk about denial of service attacks. A website comes under a DDoS attack, and it goes down. And when it goes down, it often reveals things. It reveals that the database version is 7.01. And now the attacker can say, I know that version. That version has this vulnerability. That version allows me to send it a string and escalate my privilege and suddenly become somebody else on the network. We had a bug at the National Theatre where people logged in. One person logged in with their password and they saw someone else's record. The National Theatre. They saw their history. They saw this other person's address, phone number, and the shows they'd ever been to. It's hardly life-threatening data, but it's still wrong. It's still a breach. We couldn't find that bug. So, and being the National Theatre, the customers of the National Theatre like to post the bugs on Twitter. Okay, so the world knew that this had happened. A few weeks later, it happened again. We're starting to think, should we take the system off? The frequency is so low, and the harm isn't incredible. For example, you can't buy a ticket with someone else's card. All you could do is buy someone else a ticket. You can buy a ticket, but it'll go to that person using your payment method. So, obscure bugs that are very hard to see, disappear of their own. You accidentally update the bit of software that contained the bug, and you accidentally fix the bug, but you never truly found it. So software is, of course, a huge area. Physical, we're all using the cloud, right? So I don't think these things happen as much, but it's not always true. And sometimes we have some bits of our server that are perhaps with our development team, right? And that might be in their site, and there isn't a power backup. There's no network backup. We don't have a recovery site. It's not a locked office. People can walk in. Network, the firewall's not on. Someone's already infected it with some malware. Again, hardware, this middle column, I don't know if we have this anymore, but it could apply to your laptop, right? So you've lost your laptop on a train and you switched off encryption because you didn't know why you needed it, or it was annoying, or you imagined you'd lose the password. So you just switched it off. Your laptop gets lost. And now if it contains some PII or some, IP, right? But these two on either side of the bottom, I think these are here, human weaknesses, untrained staff, right? You haven't trained them on data protection for over 2 years because it's no one's job to do that, and you've forgotten, right? You don't train them because it's an expense. IT training is phenomenally expensive, thousands of pounds per person, per year, maybe £10,000 you could easily spend on IT training. So they're untrained. They just learn it off ChatGPT these days. ChatGPT makes mistakes, so who knows, right? They're not there. They're on holiday. There's only one of them, right? Or they're off sick, or they're currently doing their own. Yeah,
so
go
John,
on.
I was going to say that, probably a vulnerability to add to the list is the likes of ChatGPT. So
yes, good point. Yes,
relying
absolutely.
on artificial intelligence, and the fact that they often provide very, inaccurate and,
100%. I mean, I'm actually currently a big user of ChatGPT.
Yeah. Oh, me too. I am too. But you know that you can't rely 100%.
You could spot its mistakes. When you spot them, they're massive. They're sort of just huge factual errors. But just tell it. I mean, I just say that bit's wrong, and it goes, "Oh, I apologize." And I've trained it to stop apologizing. I've trained it to say things like, "Good point," because I can't be doing with all this. "Oh, I apologize." It's not like that. But you're right. Good point.
But it really is very clever at hiding its, the things it makes up, basically. Because I even asked it, this is when it first came out, because I was using it to help me do research on my startup, right? And I said, can you provide me some research around, chatbots that are used in this particular way, right?
Yeah.
And it provided me with some amazing references. And I'm like, wow, that's so great. I'm like, can you give me the actual, okay, that's great. Can you please give me the kind of actual academic, research that was backing what you're saying here? Yes. Here's like 10 citations. Guess what? All of them were real publications, but none of the articles were real.
Yes, right.
Yes, and it was perfect. It was perfectly written, like as if it was an academic citation. Yeah.
I mean, the Guardian had an article saying one of their journalists was impersonated by ChatGPT. So they looked for some research, and it said that one of the Guardian journalists had written this article and linked to it. But so the Guardian goes, they said we thought, wow, we checked that out, right? But they couldn't find it. So now they're going, right, did we have it, or is this an integrity issue? We've lost the data. We did have this article. Did you? He goes, I don't think I wrote that. He goes, well, what if you've forgotten? He goes, yeah, I don't think I wrote it. And then they decided that the language was probably wrong, right? But they searched. This is the Guardian, right? They searched through their backups. They searched through their website history, trying to disprove the assertion that one of their journalists had written an article, and it looked like the language he would have used, because the ChatGPT can write you in Terry Pratchett's language. You can write it in Shakespeare's language.
My friend and co-founder for my business, she Googled herself, which you can do, right? But then she ChatGPT'd herself, right?
Yeah.
And it came back with, okay, Tiffany Norwood's done the following things, and she's published this book, and she had published a book, but that book that it quoted that she had published was not her book; it was somebody else's book.
Yeah.
Although she has written a book that's been published on Amazon or whatever, the book that ChatGPT said she wrote was basically somebody else's book.
Yes.
So if you relied on that, right, to say,
no, 100%. So it should go into here, actually, because we talk a lot about how AI is going to, perhaps it could do my job, but not unless it knows the difference between, right and wrong. And the final one on this one is process. So we've touched on that in some of our examples. If your processes are weak, then you won't do the things you said you will do in your policies, right? And so you said you would have data protection training for all staff, but you haven't done it. Why haven't you done it, right? And the number of people I have who put their heads down at this point, because they know that I'm talking about them. They go, yeah, John, we're not short of policies. We had a guy in 2 years ago. We got our policy set. We think we're compliant because we have a policy set. And I often have customers who say, John, I just want the policy set. I'm going, really? They go, yeah, because that's compliance. I say, well, it is compliance for sure, but it's not actually risk management. So if you fail to see the whole of compliance and security as a giant risk management exercise, then you aren't compliant. There's a guy from, what is it, PCI, DSS, the kind of credit card. I remember being in a session with him when I was at the National Theatre, and we were managing credit cards internally crazily, and so we did have to be this PCI. And he goes, think of all these breaches, Target, Best Buy, all of these credit card breaches. Not one of them was compliant at the time they were breached, right? And the reason is that they had stopped. The minute you're finished your compliance exercise, that entropy in your processes starts occurring. That person leaves, and that knowledge goes, and blah, blah, blah. So process is a huge chunk of the error element that we discussed previously. When we're thinking about risk, we're going to be asked about this, and often we think about what will happen if the risk occurs. This is equally true, absolutely, of standard business risks. But when we think about it here, it helps us to work out which of the kind of things we want to focus on, right? They're in no order, and as you see, the arrows go in and out, things to lead to another. So if your server is down and your customers complain to the NHS or complain to the ICO or complain to some ombudsman, you're going to start with a bit of reputation loss, right? You might have a contract that's currently being negotiated, and the local authority gets press word that you've had a major breach, right? You've sent the trans individuals' data to the journalist, and they say, we're just going to pause on the contract signing until you've resolved that. We're happy with your service, but there are clearly some weaknesses. That's the mature thing to do from their point of view. They're not trashing you. They're just saying, come back to us when you've had perhaps some kind of an audit on your practices. So that's a 50 grand contract, that's a 100 grand contract. So your financial losses are sometimes direct. So your website's down and your credit card's not working, but it could be secondary. So you've had a reputation loss and now the contract's not present. So these things can kind of link together. Operational disruption. So during the NT big bug, we put the entire development team trying to track down how it's possible. And I mean, and the root cause, or the one step down, is that a person was getting a session swap, right? When they logged into the website, they were receiving someone else's cookie, right? The cookie that said who they were wasn't their cookie. It was a cookie that had just been sent in that split second to somebody else. And the reproducible was, if I log in as an anonymous browser at the same time as someone else who's logging in as an anonymous browser, right? Why do people do that? Because they want tickets from the National Theatre, they're going to log in twice, right? So they're going to log in 3 times, so that there are 3 times in the queue, so they have 3 times a chance of getting this precious nugget of the National Theatre opening day ticket. So hence why there is this event occurring, which is anonymous browsers, and then we had this little bug that will release the same cookie to that second person. And one of them has the real cookie, that's theirs, the other one has a copy of the cookie, that other person's. Still don't know how it's happening, but at least we're now down some way down the 5 whys. The entire development team working on it. That's weeks, right, of them doing nothing else. Weeks of us changing the website to mask data with stars, weeks of being worried, weeks of creating reports, all of that from that one bug that we truly never found. It just eventually never happened again, right? And so the operational disruption is also now financial loss, right? Because you're just not doing something you should be. All of these can end up with a situation where the future of the business is now in doubt. If you had that kind of bug and it never went away and you still can't find it, right? What in fact is your solution? You're going to start the website again, you know? So you can have, if you've lost your IP, if you don't look better than your competitor, suddenly your major customers, if you're in a contract business, are going somewhere else. They might have trashed your asset. It might be a kind of breach that someone has actually destroyed a single copy of something. You go to check the backup, and the backup's the wrong thing. How did this happen? Why did this happen? There's no one's checking the backup. Why is no one checking the backup? Because we didn't ask him to check the backup. Why did we not ask him to check the backup? Because no one thought about that. We're back to our identifying the problems, the root of the problem, right? Having policies that are effective, right? Has resulted in no one ever actually trying to restore the backup. And so never actually finding that the backup's not working. It just says it is. It's backing up something. It's just backing up something else, not what you thought, right? So testing your backup, something you should do very regularly, because it is a fundamental part of how we might protect against things, against, say, ransomware. Now, we're all in the cloud. Ransomware is slightly less effective than if you have an office with servers, but it's still there. And the only way around ransomware is to have a copy from last night and you lose today's work. If you have a copy, ransomware is just not an issue, right? If you don't have a copy, it's gone. And don't think about paying, because that just doesn't work. So those are the risk impacts that we can think about. We can think about the magnitudes. We should put numbers on those losses. We should put times and effort amounts so that we can really start to say which of these risks that we are starting to identify have the greatest impact. You'll end up with a table for sure. I don't like this personally, because I don't think magnitudes are properly included in this. But you will end up with a table like this that you help seniors and externals understand why you decided to work on the risks on the right and not the risks on the left. Again, as per your standard risk map. Controls. I put a slide to explain controls for those who are going to read this later. Controls are very important, right? Is it the same as mitigation? No, it's not, right? Why is it not? It's because just the sheer amount of detail, 144 controls, right? All of which have expense, they have projects to implement. They're not there automatically. They don't come out of the box in many cases. They'll be specific to you, also common, right? You all know, for example, you've heard of Cyber Essentials. Cyber Essentials is the UK government's baseline that it believes that any organization interacting with the government should have as a minimum. So you can just go to a website called IASME, It stands for information assurance for small and medium enterprises. It 100% applies to you. It is a cheap version of ISO 27001. And Cyber Essentials is the 5 essential controls. You have passwords, right? You have firewalls. You have, you update your software periodically. Your computers are set to not automatically do something, right? 5 basic controls. So we could say, well, our control standard, yes, in some ways you could identify 5 things that will 100% fix a lot of common problems. But later on, you discover more detail, and you'll have to be selective about which controls you put in place first, for example, the order of events. There are various ways in which you can divide up the controls. Here are an example of those that other people will discuss them in different ways. The ones on the left, prevent, detect, correct. Okay, I think most control subdivisions will contain those. I mean, another subdivision could be, for example, technical, administrative, process. Like there are lots of ways in which you could, but I like these because the first thing you'd like to do with a control is see that something is about to happen, right? Or your firewall's receiving a type of attack. Someone's repeatedly logging in as you, right? And failing because they don't have your password. Well, what are they trying? Is it you? No, it wasn't me. So as an IT guy, I'd be saying, every day I should check that log, right? And I would see that this person who's on long-term sick is trying to log in, and they have failed. They've put the password in 3 times or 5 times or many times it says, and now they're locked out. But they haven't rung me. Why didn't they ring me to say my password's locked out? That's odd, right? It's a little odd. It's not very odd, but slightly odd. It's like level 1. Okay, so it's gone into my, keep an eye on this. Then they try and log in tomorrow. Again, try 3 times and they get locked out for 24 hours. But they don't call them. So who is this? Why isn't, when a person finds themselves locked out of the account, they immediately go to IT, please reset my password. And then I need to test who they are and prove who they are, but I will then reset their password. But this person's not trying. So that is an early warning that someone is attempting to break into an account, right? Detection controls. So for prevention, detection, is it happening now, right? You can spend a lot of money on this, right? There are fantastic systems to look at this in real time. And then corrective controls, we discussed earlier, your data backup. It's gone wrong. Now, how do I fix it? It's also a control. You think, well, it's not controlling it. Yes, it is. It's controlling the outcome. The risk happened. You lost some data. I'm sorry, that happens. Your hardware failed. Sorry, that happens. If you look on your hard drive, you will find lots of numbers. One of those is the mean time to failure, right? So in other words, every single hard drive will fail in the end, but have an average time at which it will fail, and it might be 3 years, it might be 4 years. But at that point, if you don't have a backup of that hard drive containing all those things you refuse to put on Google Drive because you can't be bothered, right? You have a loss. But if you do have a backup, a copy, right, you can control the impact of the risk having happened. So controls are not just about prevention, right, which is in some ways feels like the etymology of the word. It is also about controlling the impact of it, and mitigating the impact. So we have 2 on the right as well, compensating controls. At the National Theatre, sometimes Tessitura, their legacy ticketing database, would just fail. If it failed at 6 o'clock, or was looking dodgy, or was running slow, a compensating control was to print out all the tickets. So the front of house staff would just hand out the tickets when people come to pick them up. Normally, they'd like to just print them for you. That's the smart thing to do. Some people don't turn up, right? So as you turn up, you say, here's my name, my account number, and they'll print the ticket for you. But when the system was looking likely to go down, it had several failures, a compensated control would be to print all of that night's tickets in alphabetical order in advance, right? So it's a manual process for working around the issue. Deterrent controls. My example that I keep thinking of, this is not particularly IT, but when we think about child safety, right? In schools, a deterrent control is to say in the job advert, we treat this very seriously. We will check your CV for any gaps rigorously. We will investigate every single one of your jobs. So where were you, right? We investigate your DBS in some detail. And just saying those words, a lot of potential abusers will go, okay, the school's on top of it, I'm not going here. So by announcing on our website that we are ISO 27001, by demonstrating that with a tick or a badge or flag, all those kind of things you put them there, those are actually deterrents. They tell some people, okay, they'll have patched that. This isn't one for me. I'm looking for the one where there's nothing like that. In fact, where it looks like a bit of copy pasta. They don't really have it. So deterrents are there. So control types. As I say, there are 144 controls that you could have. In actual fact, you can invent lots more. A lot of them are policies.
Yeah, just to say something also about controls, which is they can also go too far, right? Like you said, you can have a control that's actually stopping people from doing anything.
100%. As we said right at the beginning, if the right person at the right place at the right time cannot access the data, right, that is a security fail.
Yeah.
Right? Because you could take the server and you could put it in a room and you unplug it. It's pretty secure now, right? No one can access it. But we could say that security is max. In actual fact, security is failed because availability is one of the three things we are protecting. Right? We are protecting the availability of it, right? Otherwise, you can just get rid of availability and unplug the server. You know, and as you know, in the civil service, say in the Foreign Office or in the Ministry of Defense, whatever, they have the air gap concept. So they have two PCs and two screens, right? One of the PCs is a different color and has a different colored wire, and that wire does not connect into. So you can go onto that PC, you log into it. It's nothing, you can't go on the web. It's not connected to it, right? Now that's not very useful. That's why you have another PC over here. This one does connect to the internet, but this one doesn't connect to that stuff at all. Physically, it is physically a gap. So in other words, the MOD's network simplified has one physical network that contains the internet and the email servers, and one physical network that contains the security secrets, the nuclear codes, right? There is no way of getting through, right? You can't sit on one and get there, you can't sit on the other and get there. That's air gapping, and is required because they have identified that control as fundamental to prevent the accidental error of doing the wrong thing in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? But I agree with you, for most of our businesses, you would never have that, right? That would be too far, and it create a huge cost, two networks, right? A huge expense, all two teams probably to manage it, etc., etc. So I totally agree with you. It has to be just the right amount of control or prevention, and again, based on the value. So if that loss would be, if someone broke in and they stole something that's 50,000, you're not going to spend more than 50,000 on it unless you can find more than 50,000 pounds worth of loss value. That could be, the secondary is now you lose a contract worth 50,000. Okay, so now it's worth spending 100,000 on mitigating this risk. That could be time and effort, right? It could be expense. You could put in a tool to detect. Lots of policies, password policies, cryptographic policies, mobile phone use policies. We talked earlier about the fact that you should have a IT procurement policy that contains how secure is this supplier, how resilient is this supplier, for the evidence that those would be in policies that you create, and they're tedious, okay, but necessary. And what is a policy? It is merely your intention, okay? And this is why when people say, I just need the policies, and they've no intention of doing anything about it, then that's a clear fail. A policy is just simply saying it is the business's intention to comply with the Data Protection Act. And so what we will do is we will do some things. We will train all staff. We will ensure we have access and controls. We will ensure we have lawful reasons. We will ensure we review those. We will ensure we delete staff based on the retention policy, see retention policy, and they'll link. The policies are now linking to each other. This is the retention policy. This is the access control policy. This is the blah, blah, blah. Okay, great. All these policies are now in place. Now what? Nothing. Where are the actions? So I like organizations to think about things. Now, if you think about, say, the NHS, they've had great, or health systems around, health services around the world, have had great success with the checklist concept. Okay, so it is our policy of this hospital to not leave a swab inside the patient. That's our policy. But what if I don't have a checklist? I could just forget, right, to check for the swab, right, and the patient goes home with a foreign object inside. Instead, now the NHS, in this level, just runs on checklists. Right, pilots run on checklists. The checklist is the aide memoir that prevents you doing something that prevents you forgetting. Okay, but also let's put some of those things into a time frame as well. And so I like to see organizations have a policy actions calendar. So I've faked one up here. What do we do every day? We check that the backup worked. We check the security logs for odd logins, right? We check the leavers list from HR to make sure that somebody who has left today has been suspended, right? Weekly, we make sure that things like servers are not running out of space, that we've not lost licenses, that all the licenses have credit cards that are working. Monthly, we make sure that all the laptops are still on Intune as compliant. Quarterly, we will send around a SurveyMonkey quiz, right, to make sure that users know the answers to the data protection training, are confirming that they've read the data protection training, are confirming that in writing to you, that they understand that they are now accountable for mistakes that they make, that it would actually be on them and not on you, right? Annually, you're going to be held accountable. Okay, so this actions calendar, each of these should then have a link to say, which policy am I referring to, right? Well, the backup policy, right? The resilience policy, the business continuity policy will be saying, please make sure the backup works. So you can now, if the policy changes, you now know to go and change the calendar, right? So you've now created a link between practice, checklists and calendar to your policies. Finally, literally my last slide, accountability for this. Related to our calendar is who will do this, right? And the famous saying is that people do work, right? If you don't have someone who's listed to do it, they won't do it. Again, my encouragement is put this in someone's job description, right? So that they can be held accountable by you for why they didn't do it. So here's the minimum, right? There should be a director in your organization, a non-exec with responsibility, I can't spell responsibility, for information security and privacy, okay? That's not the person who's the data protection officer. I have a few organizations in the Health Foundry who are going, yeah, my DPO is also on the board. I'm having a conflict of interest squirm at that point. This person should do nothing but hold everybody else to account, not themselves, somebody else, right? There should be a senior leader. In very large organizations, they call the senior information risk officer, right? When you're applying for NHS contracts, they will say, who is your CIRO? And you go, I don't know. You go, well, make it somebody, write it in their job description. And yes, it could be the CEO. Yes, it could be the COO, right? If you're very large, of course, it could be an information leader, but it's going into somebody's job description. Ensure that all the things we need to do to be secure, compliant, are on your job list, at least annually, right? Someone is the privacy officer. I think it's a slightly different role from the security concept. Why? Because the security officer will make decisions about where to put data, right? And they're making decisions that the privacy officer might have an issue with, right? You can outsource privacy officer, that's the DPO, right? That's what I do. You can outsource that, but you can insource that as well. Lots of organizations insource that, right? You can insource that for cost reasons. You could insource it because you're big enough to have an independent role. And that role reports to the senior leader and reports to the board. This privacy officer does not report 4 rungs down. They report when on this issue. And it could be someone's part-time job. So you could say someone, you're the IT administrator, I'm going to give you privacy. It's tricky. Why? Because they're saying, I've decided to move the storage onto Amazon. And they override themselves when they say, do I have a contract for that? Do I have a lawful reason to exit this data from this country to America? It doesn't matter. I'm going to do it because it's cheap, right? So that's why I've separated these 2 roles. The person who's making IT decisions is slightly different from the person making privacy decisions. I'm really conscious of a minute's worth of time left. So I'm going to pause right now and say, that's enough. What are the questions? What's missing? This is the first time I've done this particular set of courses or info nugget sessions. So if there are questions, then they're just going to get fed into the next version I do of this.
I guess the only thing I was going to say is maybe just a little bit more in future around the examples of the register that you showed at the beginning.
Right.
That might be helpful.
Yeah.
You
So
know,
I'm
because
going to
people
cover that.
want to know what
that.
like what kind of things would I actually put in my
Yeah. So I'm covering that in the next session.
Okay.
So the 2 things that are missing off the advertised list were the privacy management program, right? Which is in some ways what the government would like to replace how we think about data protection compliance, right? Is in fact a risk management process, right? So the government would like us to move away from saying I've got 3 policies. I've appointed a DPO. I'm compliant to saying, what is this data I have and what risks to harm would processing it cause to individuals? Not that you're doing it unlawfully, but that you're just doing it at all, right? That, people often think, yes, well, as long as I'm lawful. Yeah, not really. It's lawful to do all kinds of things. You can have legitimate interest to do things that still might be harmful to somebody. Do we understand how the harm might occur through, you know, the various ways in which we process, for example, in automated decision making? So increasingly we have automated, not necessarily AI, but just machine learning processing. What are the potential harms for that, even if it's legal? So privacy management program and the data protection impact assessment. Again, the government would like to get rid of that. I actually think it's a great document. It is another slice of risk management around processing, and you expect it to happen. So I was thinking of going through that with a bit of a deep dive. Well, we'll make up a company, we'll create a data protection impact assessment, and that will allow us to really say, where are our information assets? How do we describe those? How do we start to expand on those? And the other thing to include in that was the Article 30. So the Article 30.
I was going to say the records of processing activities.
Exactly.
Like, what would that look like for a small business?
Exactly. Well, and you just go to the ICO and download the template.
Okay.
All right, it's there. They've got a nice little spreadsheet. It's filled in with some examples. You fill in your own. It's honest that, like, accountability at the ICO is remarkably easy. What they ask is really small, which is why we shouldn't think about accountability to the ICO. Honestly, if you have some processes in place, they'll just turn around and say, what went wrong? And you say, well, we didn't follow our policy, so we've changed our training practice and we've added this diary item. That'll take care of the go. That's fine, right? So unless you do something truly heinous, it's the heinous thing that will bring down your business, not the ICO. I mean, it's 4% of revenue. I mean, honestly, just build it into your build it into your costs. Just pay for that. Who cares? For large businesses, just use these fines and they just say that's the cost of business. Make sure the customer pays for it. Charge the customer for when we fail, right? So it's not the amount that will kill you. It's the fact that your customers go, I've heard about you. And that your customers may well be, for example, health authorities, health boards, and they have their own data protection officers. You know, and I've sat in on several meetings with Health Foundry customers, and they've asked me to sit in because they're now with the King's Fund Trust, and there's the data protection officer over there, one of those data protection officers for whom only the letter of the law. ... I'm not sure about that. And this, I'm encouraging organizations to be risk oriented, move forward when they're comfortable that they can manage their risks, make sure they're picking up compliance as part of that, but not just compliance over here and risk over here. These are the kind of DPOs who go, where's your, I need a copy of that contract. I need a copy of this contract, a copy. Okay. So if you have customers like that.
Yeah, and John, I was going to say, if in a future session, or maybe you already have this built in, but I guess a lot of people in the Health Foundry are working with, in some way, with the NHS. So what are the NHS looking for in particular? Would be helpful.
100%. So there is a session at the end. So the fourth session is going to be cybersecurity. But in actual fact, we could roll that into DTAC, which is the NHS's digital technology assessment criteria, right? And so if you are going to be an NHS supplier, you have to pass DTAC. And DTAC says you're data protection compliant, you have cyber essentials in place already, which is what I was going to do, the cybersecurity part. And you have a data protection impact assessment, blah, blah, blah. So that's right. It's nothing onerous. It's stuff you should already have. It just wraps it up in evidences that you have it. I think they are about to change to something more prescriptive, right? That they themselves have written, which is again a headache because now you're just meeting yet more standards. But honestly, if you should already have cyber essentials, and you should be thinking about one of those ISO type ones. So ISO 27001, the gold standard. If you have that, you will pass every single test the NHS asks, but it's quite onerous to get, right? So the IASME produces a lighter version with a read across between ISO and their own work, and a read across to the NHS. So IASME have actually done a lot of that work to say, if you pass our gold standard information assurance, you will read across and be able to tick boxes all the way down ISO, you're able to tick boxes all the way down NHS criteria. So I think, yes, that would be a good 20-minute session perhaps in the last one, or the next one, or however my processes go in the next month.
Excellent.
Great. Thank you, John. That was really helpful for me as well.